I was born just before World War I. I was born in a very interesting place, New Orleans, Louisiana. We enjoy going back to New Orleans and seeing that very interesting city, very exciting city, and ministering to the people that live there today. It is always an excitement to go there. I lived in the crescent of the Gulf of Mexico all of my youth, totally, in New Orleans, and then Pascagoula, Mississippi, where they had a great shipbuilding corporation. My father worked in a machine shop and working mostly with railroads and with shipbuilding all of my youth. And so we went from Pascagoula to Mobile, Alabama, to Panama City, Florida, and lived for a short time in Laurel, Mississippi, where he worked in the roundhouse, they called it, of the railroad shops. And so I was very closely related to a strong man and a very sinful man. It was my father. We had an interesting home in that my mother, from my earliest remembrance, knew God, had strong relationships with God, was a woman of remarkable faith, and my father, years later, was the last one to ever be saved. There were 7 children in our home. I was number 6. There would have been 8. One passed away when he was only 18 months old, a little boy named Archie. As I grew up in this home, my mother loved religion very much, and my father wasn't religious, but it didn't bother him. He could go to church and sit there and just look at it. It didn't seem to bother him. But he wasn't religious, especially in the machine shop. He wasn't religious. And he smoked and he drank and he chewed tobacco and committed adultery, and he just lived a sinner's life. You might say to a full measure. He lived it. And my mother was the opposite, almost an angel, a very devoted person to the Bible and to what they call ladies' prayer groups in those days. And so there was quite a difference in our family. Well, a boy growing up in a family like that will very likely determine very quickly that there's a difference here. You know, my mother is religious, and if you get that way, you have to be good. My father is a sinner. If you go that way, man, you can do anything you want to do. And so I leaned very strongly toward my father. Now, I leaned toward him in doing what he did, but not with my affections. My mother was so good and so kind. You know, I can never remember my mother ever saying, "I'll tell your daddy on you." Never remember such a thing. When you needed a switching, she gave it to you. She didn't even talk to him about it when he came home. That was his problem. When he wasn't there, she ran the house. And when you needed discipline, she gave it to you. She didn't say, "Your daddy will get you when he comes home." Never heard a thing like that in my whole life. My mother was a very strong person in God and also in disciplining her home. And so she had real admiration coming from us, because she was also a woman of great faith that I can tell you about. One of my first remembrances as a child was that she had cancer on her breast, a large open cancer. It was larger than the hole was larger than an American silver dollar, and it was deep into the breast. And in those days, the doctors only knew one thing, and that was with a knife to cut it out. And they always told you, "We never get the roots, it'll come back." And so she was praying and not knowing what to do, and the doctors were waiting for a decision. And during this time, she had a dream. And she dreamed that Jesus came into her room, her bedroom, while she was sleeping, and stood at the foot of the bed and reached over and touched her. And this was just a dream. So the next day she told my father, says, "I had a dream that Jesus came into my bedroom and that he touched me and I was healed." He grunted a few times, you know. He didn't know much about anything like that. He knew a lot about other things like sin, but he didn't know a lot about that. And so that was the end of it. But 3 or 4 mornings later, it came back to my father's mind. He said, "You know, you haven't mentioned that cancer in several days." He says, "When are you going back to the doctor?" my mother said, well, tomorrow is the regular time to go back for the dressing of it and all. It was an open, bleeding mess. That they kept the thing out there that, you know, that stood out like a great big bag there to catch all this blood and stuff that was coming out of it. It was an open, running cancer. And my mother said, I'll check it. The doctor won't mind, I'm sure. So she went in and pulled back all the tapes that were this thing up on her shoulder and cleared out into here, you see. And she pulled it back just in time. There in the gauze lay something that looked like a little baby octopus. There was a core to it, a center, and out from it went things like little strings. And that was out from it. They were the tendrils of this cancer. And all lay there in the gauze. And she looked in the mirror and she felt, and new skin had grown clear across the hole. And it was gone. When she showed my father this, it made an impression. And she forever told it. She told us children about it. She told it in church and testimony meetings. She was a witness unto God. Now that will impress, you know, a child growing up. And another thing that greatly impressed me as a child was my grandfather, our mother's father. Someone brought him to our house. His wife was dead. He lived alone for a great number of years toward the end of his life. They brought him to our house in a wheelchair to visit my mother, his daughter. And he had had a stroke. He couldn't feed himself and he couldn't clothe himself. And so my mother was to take care of him for a while. And she did take care of him. She called in the ladies' prayer meeting. Now my grandfather at that moment wasn't what I'd call a Christian. But they prayed for that too. Then that bunch of women, you know, 8 or 10 of them stood around and said, Mr. Chandler, do you believe in God? Yes. You believe in Jesus? Yes. Do you believe in healing? Yes. You know, they said, now give your heart to Jesus. And so they led him in the sinner's prayer, and then they began to pray for him. You know, in our front room of our house, the power of God came on that man. And the Spirit of the Lord touched him from his head right straight down through his total body. And he came up out of that wheelchair when he couldn't walk a step and began to walk. His arms that were dead began to move. Now, I knew him personally at least for the next 15 years before he passed away. And I was in his home the night he passed away. He lived alone, and he did his own cooking, mind you. He took care of his own house. He'd have a housekeeper to come in maybe once a week to clean the place up. Otherwise, he took care of himself with no problem. He didn't get sick. I was there. He didn't get sick the night he died. His regular time for bed was about 8 o'clock. So when 8 o'clock came, he went off to bed, and I was sitting in another room with one of my other brothers. And in his house, we heard a little struggle, and we went in. It was too late. He was already gone. He was already gone. Without sickness and without any great problem, he just left this world. And so I saw that amazing healing. I saw my granddaddy in the wheelchair. I saw him not able to walk, not able to feed himself, and he stayed there with us for days, fully healed and fully well. That'll have an impression on a boy. You know, that'll bring faith into his heart. You know, that you're sure. It'll have some effect on you. But when it came to loving the people of God, that was a long way off. I followed my father real closely in that. He didn't like preachers. He called them beggars. He thought that if you didn't sweat and you didn't work with steel and iron in a shop, or if you didn't work in a field with the ground, you weren't working really. I don't know that he ever thought that my mother worked in the house, you know, that it automatically got cleaned up, the food automatically got on the table. I never heard him express any appreciation for that kind of work. But the man that got out there in the field and in the shop, oh, he was a man. He was a real man. And he didn't like preachers. He said preachers were a group of people that were too lazy to work, and so they took up that profession to keep from working. Well, I like that. As a sinner, you know, that sounded good. So I went around burping that out. And I didn't like, you know, 50 years ago, when an evangelist would come, they weren't like evangelists today. They would come to a church to hold what they called a revival meeting in those days. They'd put their children in school. Oh, they had no intention of just staying 1 week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. It was nearer to 3 months. And they had these meetings every night. And God only knows the people would come from everywhere to them. Hundreds would find Christ as a Savior, and a whole community would get a change. Now, in those days, evangelists did not live in hotels. They lived in the home of the saints. In our church, it was my house. My father made a good living, had good transportation with cars, and so my house is where they ended up. And I didn't like it, and my father didn't like it, but my mother did, and that settled it. She invited them. Here they came. They took my bedroom and my bed, and they stayed for 3 months. I usually ended up either sleeping with some of the other kids, or I ended up sleeping on the floor on what we call a pallet. A pallet is a hard place between you and the foundation. And so I didn't like them. And you know, they would have first place at the table. Even their kids could eat before I ate. And sometimes they'd have 5 or 6 kids with them. And so I had a real distaste, you know, for preachers, and especially for their kids. And then I would like to confess and ask forgiveness again. I suppose I mistreated them. I mean, those preachers' kids had every reason to hate the ministry because of some treatment I gave them. One of them had a boy about my size, and I didn't like him, of course. I thought he was kind of a sissy, and of course he was a person that had no certain dwelling place. You know, here 3 months, there 3 months, here 1 month, and over there 2 months. How's a kid going to grow up? But I had no sympathy for him. And so I took him one day, I poured molasses in his hair, then I got 2 handfuls of flour, and I mixed it with the molasses. Well, they did everything they could to get molasses and flour out of that kid's head. They never did do it. They had to shave his head. And I thought that was about the best deed, and my dad didn't mind either. He smiled about it. My mother whipped me for it and said, you shouldn't do that. I said, well, he wanted it. That was a lie. I beat him down and did it. And so I was a troublemaker, and an early troublemaker. If they hung up their trousers or turned their back, I stole their money, and I'd go off and spend it. And so the preachers didn't have an easy time. They were always singing, God help Lester, God save Lester. And I was saying, yeah, well, you get out of my house and God can do a lot better with me. But anyway, I grew up with a kind of a hatred toward preachers and really toward churches. And this continued until I was just 16 years of age plus, and I began to spit up blood from my mouth. And I didn't tell anybody at first. You know, I just spitting up blood. But finally, it got visible. I would spit it up at night on my pillow, and my mother would say, what's that blood doing? And I coughed. But when it got to be there every morning, she said to the doctor, our doctor, we lived in Panama City, Florida at that time. Our doctor lived in just a few houses from us. And we lived right down on the beach in a very beautiful home. My room was made up of 24 windows. And so we had plenty of fresh air and plenty of sunshine, excepting I was sick with tuberculosis. And so the doctor said, well, I can see you every day. There's no need of taking you off to a hospital. Anything I can do for you there, I can do for you here. And so he would come to see me every day. And I began to just, like a balloon, go down. I was dying. The flesh just rolled off of me until they estimated that I weighed about 93 pounds. I was just a stack of bones. When I hit my 17th birthday, I had been laying in bed for several months, and I was bleeding from the lungs, coughing up my life, spitting up blood, and had a tubercular fever that they couldn't break, and I was dying. It's an awful feeling to know you're dying. You know, to be sure that you're dying is an awful thing. And I hated that. I wanted to live. I wanted to be a businessman. I wanted to make a lot of money. And I didn't want tuberculosis, but I had it. So I had a real distaste for everybody, especially religious people that would come into the room. And my mother, so persistent, she'd bring that gang of old women, you know, like the prayer meeting women. They'd come in and stand around the bed and say some of the silliest things. They'd say, oh God, why does this dear little innocent child suffer? And I'd stick my head under the cover and cuss them. I would have cussed them outside the cover, but my mother to give me a strapping in bed if I had. And so I had to cuss them underneath. I said, I'm nothing that you think I am. I'm not innocent, and I'm not little. I'm not anything you think I am, and I don't want you in here. Just get out. And I'd tell my mother, I said, don't bring that bunch of old women back here anymore. Here they'd come back again next week to see if I was improved. And I wasn't. I was worse. Now, that reveals something. You can pray for some people and do them no good at all, because they don't want it. And you can pray all you want to until you die, and it won't do any good. They don't want it anyway. And I was in that category. This went on for about 5 or 6 months, and I was dying of tuberculosis. And one afternoon about 4 o'clock, I began to cough and to spit up blood, and it was getting bad. My mother called the doctor quick and says, Lester's worse than usual. Please, please, please come in a hurry. So he came running over and tried to take a pulse and tried to get a little pinch of blood and, you know, all the things that doctors do. And he said, I can't get anything out of this boy. Nothing. He said he has no pulse and he can't get any blood out. And he says, and he looked at my mother and said, call your husband. This boy's dying. And so the whole family got around me there, and the doctor said, you know, in 2 hours, this boy will be dead. He said, that's the death rattle in his throat right now, and that bluishness over his face. He's not getting enough blood to his brain and to his body to live. Says he's going to die tonight. And he took my father over in the corner and put his arm up around him. We were good friends. And said, now, Mr. Sumrall, he says, I'm going back to the office, and says, I'll write out his death notice and sign it. And you can pick it up on my desk tomorrow morning and get a place in the graveyard for him, a lot. He says they don't sell lots out there unless you got a certificate of death, and so your certificate of death will be there. That's just over 240,000 hours ago. It's amazing how far some doctors can be wrong. 240 hours wrong is quite a bit of being wrong, you know. And he left the room. And my parents stood around crying. Well, I wasn't crazy. I knew what was going on. I knew that doctor said something very bad, and my parents were crying because of it. And when I saw him leave, I said, when he leaves, the jig's up. You know, I'm going to die. And at that moment, I've only had 2 visions in my life. I saw my first vision. On one side of my bed, I saw a coffin, just my size, and open and tilted, very pretty inside, empty, waiting for me. It was mine. And I looked at it and I said, ooh, there's my coffin. And it's very pretty, all right, except I don't want that. I turned my head the other way, and there was the biggest Bible in the world. It was from the floor to the ceiling beside my bed. The letters stood up that high. I looked, and God said, that's my word. And he said, you will have to take one of these tonight. Oh, I said, yes, Lord. You know, I said, I'll go to church and I'll get right. God says, no, you've told me that before. He says, tonight you will take that coffin or that book. I want you to preach my word or you're going to die tonight. Well, you know, if you've heard about Southerners, we're a little slow making up our minds. And we would prefer leaving it for tomorrow if we can, rather than today. And so I said, now, Lord, I'm going to do that. And the Lord said, you are, right now. He says, there are no more sunrises for you. And there are no more daylight for you. You are going to either be put in that casket or you are going to take my word and proclaim it. And I said, well, Lord, I don't want to die. I'm afraid to die. I'm not ready to die. And so evidently, I'm going to take the word, you know, the Bible. And then I made a commitment with God. I made a covenant. I said, God, if you'll keep me alive as long as I preach, I'll soon be the oldest man in the world. And I went to sleep. My family stood around to watch me die. You know, some families believe in the doctor more than they do in God. And he said I was going to die, and so they stood by, wringing their hands and waiting for me to die. But I didn't die. The next morning, I opened my eyes, and I looked around. There was my mother, and I said, I'm hungry. Oh, she says, I'll get you some grape juice. I said, I've had all the grape juice I want for a long time. She says, what do you want? I says, I want exactly what my father had for breakfast. Now, you know, way down south years ago, I suppose it's the same. When we had breakfast, we had breakfast. We didn't just smile at the table. We had breakfast. We had biscuits that Fannie Mae didn't make, or any other May. They were made in the kitchen, and they were big enough, you know, they were good. And we had white gravy, and we had eggs, and we had ham that you couldn't read the newspaper through. It was the real stuff, and it was delicious, and it was good. And we had grits, If you hadn't had any grits yet, you don't know what you've missed. And we ate breakfast. And I said, that's what I want. My mother said, no. Says, you haven't had any solid food for weeks. Said, you would die if you ate that. I looked up at her with a funny little smile. I said, you know, I'm going to die full of ham and eggs and hot biscuits and gravy and grits. Go get it. Well, my mother said, you know, I've always heard that if you're going to die, you're supposed to give a person the last request. And so the doctor said you're going to die, and no doubt you are delirious. She didn't know what had happened. She didn't know I was healed. There was no blood on that pillow that morning. She didn't look to see. No, I'd been healed. I never did have another drop of blood to come out of my mouth. I never did have that fever again. It was gone. I was healed by God's, but I hadn't gotten to tell her that yet. I just asked for all that food. Well, upon the idea that a dying person should have what they want, she went and cooked it all up, put it by the side of my bed on a little table, and left the room. She didn't want to face the issue. Man, I got up on my elbow and I reached over there and I began to eat. And I ate everything on that plate as if you'd called in the cat. And he had licked it. There wasn't a thing left but a clean plate. My mother came back and said, where's that food? I said, it's in here. She said, all of it? I said, that's not all. I want some more. Well, she said, not now. You just let me talk to the doctor about this and see what he said. I said, I'm all right. You don't need that doctor anymore. I said, last night I saw a vision. I saw a coffin. I saw a Bible. I said, I'm going to be a preacher. Now, I was the meanest kid she'd ever had. She had beat me more than she had the whole family put together. She had threatened to send me away to a reformatory. And here I was talking about preaching. She went delirious. She wept and she cried and she said, oh, God, can it be, can it be? I said, yeah, I'm healed. She says, I'm strong. I'm not weak anymore. And she rejoiced, unbelievably. And nobody else believed it. They thought, but 3 days later, I was walking all over the house. You know, strength was just flowing out of me. 10 days later, a neighbor boy of ours came by and said, say, you want to go fishing? I said, yes. We went out on the Gulf of Mexico fishing. Spent the whole day out there. Man, we came back with mullet, enough to make quite a bit of money. We also went along the bank and got us a few crabs and put in that boat. And while we were out there, we just picked up a few oysters. We came back loaded with goodies, and I ate it. We enjoyed it. 10 days later, that happened. 3 weeks later, God spoke to my heart and said, did you promise me that you would preach? I says, I did. He says, well, get to doing it then. Don't delay it. Do it now. Ooh, I says, well, I thought I was still recuperating, you know. But I had no pains. I was gaining weight. My face was changing. You could see the bones sticking through, and it was changing. And my flesh was lighting up with the pinkness that it hadn't had. And so things were changing. Well, you know, my daddy was my old standby. So we called him Papa. And I went in the kitchen while he was eating breakfast. He'd eat early, about 6:30 in the morning before, and the rest of us ate. Then he'd go off to work, and later my mother would feed the rest of the family. And so I went in there early, and I sat down at the other side of the kitchen table. He was eating by himself. And I said, Papa, I'm going to preach. Now, if you had shot him, he wouldn't have been any more surprised. He says, well, I'll be damned. He took both fists and hit the table until his plate jumped up off the table. And he began to cuss me. He cussed me with everything that you could cuss a poor kid for. And said, you're not going to do it. I won't have you doing it. You've got to be a businessman, and I'm going to see to it that you're a businessman. And I've got a lot of things to... Well, I was dying. He had nothing for me. On the doctor's desk was a piece of paper, and that was my death certificate. And here he was cooking all this stuff up because I was getting better. And he didn't even finish his breakfast. He got through cussing me, and he threw his napkin on the table. He went to the back door and screamed at me. And when he was angry with me, he didn't call me Lester. He called me boy. He said, boy, you be here when I get back tonight. I have more to say. Well, I wasn't there. I wasn't following him anymore. Now, that was the end of my following him for the rest of my life. I went upstairs to my room. It was made out of 24 windows, nothing but windows on all sides. And I laid down on the floor with my belly, and I began to cry. And I began to shake and to tremble. Among the things that he told me, he said, if you go, you'll starve to death. Nobody's going to feed a lazy boy. I wasn't lazy. He knew that. I was a worker. But I laid there crying, and God spoke to me. He started something that day that he's kept up for a long time. God speaks to me out of his word. Out of his word, he speaks to me. I don't just close my eyes and say, what do I have? I don't do that. But God gave me something specific. He said, you read Isaiah 41, 10 and 11. I didn't know what it was. I said, well, all right, I'll read it. So lying on the floor, I reached and got my Bible, and I began to read. Fear thou not, I am with thee. Be not dismayed, I am thy God. I will strengthen thee, I'll help thee. I'll uphold thee with the right hand of my righteousness. Behold, all that were incensed against thee shall be ashamed and confounded. They shall be as nothing, and they that strive with thee shall perish. Whew. I said, I didn't know that was in the Bible. Is it still there? Is it left? When I heard somebody else read that verse, I'd say, oh, don't read that, that's mine. I thought that nobody else ever got that but me, that God put it in there through Isaiah for me only. The first words, fear thou not, 3 words. Do you know a miracle took place? It was as I felt a hand go down through my mouth and end about this region of my being and come back up. And it was as if he had pulled up a turnip out of a patch and the little tendrils were hanging down below it. He pulled it out and fear was gone. You know, the Bible says God has not given us a spirit of fear, that fear is a spirit. I felt fear come up out of me. It was gone. Gone. It was gone. Fear was gone. I suddenly, now, you see, I'm a small man. My father was a big man. He stood about 6'2" or 3. He weighed about, 250, 260. He had a muscle up here that just stood up like an ark, and he prided in it. He was more proud of his physical muscles than he was anything else on the face of the earth. He thought he could beat any man fighting that ever came up against him. Well, I took after my mother. I'm a business person, and I'm a thinker. He wasn't. He was the opposite. But I didn't have all that physical strength, that he boasted about. And brother, when he spanked you, you saw stars and stripes and a lot of other things. It was awful. You were always glad when he got through and hoping he wouldn't start over again sometime. And you tried to keep things on the level with him, even if you had to tell a lie, because he was too strong to whip a kid. And I'd already found that out. But I lost fear of him. Fear was gone. Ooh. I said, you don't mean anything. The Bible says you don't. Fear thou not. I lost fear. He said, I'd starve to death. I said, no, he is wrong. You better believe he's wrong. Fear thou not. I am with thee. And then I laughed. Whew. I don't know whether I'd had a good laugh in a long time or not. I'd been sick so long. I laughed. I said, my papa won't go. But my heavenly Father said he'd go. He said, fear thou not. I am with thee. He'll take time off to go with me. Well, if he'll go with me, I don't care who don't go. If he'll go, I'll go. Ooh, what a commitment I made to God. Yeah, it was exciting. Fear thou not, for I am with thee. And I read it very slowly, word by word. I am with thee. He said, be not dismayed. I was dismayed. I didn't have any sermons. I just got up out of bed. I didn't know how to conduct a meeting. I'd never paid that much attention to a religious meeting. So no, there were just 2 things I knew. I didn't want to go to anybody's church. I didn't like churches. And I didn't want to see a preacher. I didn't like preachers. So I had to stay away from preachers and churches. So I knew where I had to go. I had to go out into the cotton fields and the corn fields and find little country schoolhouses and there talk to the country people. Now I knew that, and I was ready to do that because I wanted to stay alive. So I read those verses too, and especially that verse 11, the last word, and they that strive with thee shall perish. I said, whoo, you better leave me alone. Look at the armor I'm coming at you with. And those 2 verses have been a cornerstone and an anchorage in my life from that moment until this moment right now. With other scriptures that God has given me, in every crisis of my life, God gave me a scripture. And I've been guided by the Bible since I was a boy. So when God told me this, I got up, I dressed. I looked around my room for my belongings. In the closet, I found the little suitcase about this big. You older folks remember them. We used to buy them in Woolworths and in Crest stores. They were made out of fiberboard, very thin fiberboard. They were brown, you remember, and had two little buckles on them, you know, that you snapped them down with. And so I found one of those little things about that big, and I put all my earthly belongings in it, and had quite a bit of room left over. And I picked up that thing, and I came marching down the steps, downstairs. There my mother was. Mothers are wonderful creatures, you know. And there's nobody in the world like a mother. And there was my mother. She said she had heard the fight, you know, in the kitchen, but she didn't show herself. My mother was a very smart lady. She stayed out of problems. She can handle them one at a time, but not two. And she knew that I was up against my father, and she didn't appear. It was just him and me. She heard the sobbing upstairs on that floor. And here I came marching down stairs with my little suitcase. She said, "Where are you going?" Well, I said, as I told you, when I saw that vision, and God told me to preach, I am going out to preach. She said, "Well, where are you going?" I said, "No, honey, that don't make any difference where I'm going." I said, "I am going right now." Oh, she began to cry. You know, mothers can turn it on and turn it off better than anybody else in the world. They can cry when they're happy, cry when they're sad, cry when they don't know which way they are. They're professionals. So, oh, she began to cry again. And I said, "No, you cried for years that I wasn't saved. And you cried when I did get saved. You prayed for years that I'd be a preacher. Now I'm going to do it, and you're still crying." Oh, she says it's tears of joy. She said, "Now, where should I write you?" I said, "You don't write me." I said, "I'll write you. I'll tell you where I am, but," I said, "I have something to tell you. I will not be back. I am going to stay out there as long as I live. I'm going out to stay." And so it's goodbye. And I never went back to that house, never went back to that home. My parents came to see me on the road, and until I went around the world, I never came anywhere where they were living. They came to see me 3 or 4 times, but I never did go back. I never went back to the state of Florida for years. I completely cut my roots. And so I walked out the front door, and there was my buddy that we'd gone fishing with, you know, 10 days after I was here. He said, "Hi, where are you going?" I says, "I'm going out to preach." He looked me up and down, and he saw I was sincere, and he saw I had my little suitcase. He looked at me and he says, "Can I go with you?" Well, I'd never thought of that. I said, "What could you do?" Now, he could have asked me the same thing, you know, but he didn't. He was too kind for that. He says, "Well, if you do the preaching, I can do the songs." I said, "Can you sing?" He said, "No." Now, he was very nice. He didn't say, "Can you preach?" Or I'd have had to say no. But if there's anything better than 1 cabbage, it's 2. And we were 2 greenheads. I said, "Yeah, you can go." He said, "You know, my car works." You know, when boys have a car, normally they don't work. He was about 2 years older than I, and was more mature than I, and had his own car. He might have been 20. That would have made him 3 years older than I was. But he had a car. Now, I don't remember that it had any fenders, but boys don't need fenders in their cars. If it has an engine, you know, and a steering wheel, that's the biggest thing it needs if it's got some rubber underneath it. So we got into this thing. I think it was an old Ford. I mean Model T, you know, way on back. And so we got in it, and it was one of those remarkable cars, you know. It would make about 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. It's a boom, boom. And I said, "You sure it's going to go in?" "Oh, yeah." He says, "I worked on it myself." And that car was very interesting. You know, cars are supposed to burn gas. That one burned water and gas. We had to put water in it more than we did gas. We kept a jug of water because it would explode about every 10 miles. And it got so hot it would just quit. And so we kept babying it along. It kept our mind on the car, not on what was going to happen. And I guess that was a good thing. After we'd gone for a couple of hours or more, we were both exhausted. And we pulled over to the side of the road there in North Florida and parked under a big tree. It was a persimmon tree. Yeah. And the persimmons were ripe. And while old Lizzie cooled down and cooled off, we began to eat persimmons. And I would climb the tree to get one better. You know, when you're 17 years old, you sure don't look like a preacher, you know. And we helped ourselves to persimmons. Thank God they were ripe. You know, green persimmons was just about past being edible. And we enjoyed our first meal away from home, free of charge and no tips, you know. It was nice. Then we got into this old thing, and we went another few miles. And out in the cornfield, I saw a little white house, little schoolhouse. It would have seated 40, 45, 50 maybe. And I said, that's it right there. That's it right there. So we stopped, and I went around looking for a person. I said, who has the key to the schoolhouse? I said, this farmer over here, and he's over there in that field plowing. So I went across the field. I got over there, and this old farmer, well, he may not have been so old. He just looked old. You know, to a kid, you know, if you're 40, you look old. But he had lost all of his teeth, and he loved tobacco. And he had it coming out of both sides of his mouth without a tooth in his head, running down here in a stream and falling off on both sides. And he was dressed not in one pair of overalls, two, one beneath the other. And they both were dirty. And here I saw this. He may not have been so old. He might have been just 50. He looked like 150 to me. You know, to a boy, you can look old in a hurry. And so I looked at him, and I said, your name is so-and-so? Yeah. I said, you have the key to that schoolhouse over there? Yeah. I said, give me that key. I said, I'm going to preach in that schoolhouse. And he was just about to say no, and I said, no, listen. I said, I was dying of tuberculosis in Panama City, Florida. And I said, God healed me on one condition, that I'd preach. And he said, I haven't preached yet, but I've got to preach. And I've got to preach right now. I've got to preach tonight. And I said, if you don't give me the key to that schoolhouse, I'll die of tuberculosis. And I said, you're to blame for it. Who? If you ever seen a farmer have a fit, that one had one. Oh, he said, no. I said, yes. And he went after that key. It was down either in the second pair of overalls or something below that. He went down through there until he found an old greasy string that was tied in a circle, and on the end of it was a key. He said, here it is, go unlock it. And I said, do you have a lantern? I need a lantern. You know, there was no electricity out in the corn patch. And so, oh yeah, my house is over there, go tell my wife, give you a lamp. So we went over and we swept it up and had church that night. There were 8 people out, not a single woman, just men. What a mess. Yeah. When they sat down, they began to talk to each other out loud. And it was supposed to be church, you know. And then they were all chewing tobacco. And they'd say, and then they'd spit, and it would hit the wall. Go, poop, whoo. You know, I was reared in the city. That was just a little too much for me. None of them washed before they came. They were all dirty. And I didn't like what I'd gotten into. I just wondered if I shouldn't have gone ahead and taken that beautiful little coffin and died. This was almost worse than death. And there were only 8 of them there, and they didn't sit down properly. They would sit down and do what we call scoot. They'd sit down, and these were just homemade desks out in the country. They were not factory made. They were homemade desks and rather crude. And they would just sit down, and all you could see was a nose and a bald head peeping up at you. It looked like men from outer space more than anything else. And I was pretty discouraged. I told my friend, I said, go ahead and lead the song service. It wasn't 4 minutes later, he said, I'm finished. He couldn't sing, and neither could the 8 men. And so he gave it back to me. Well, I didn't know what to do. I said, well, I tell you, I was a bad boy. Ha, 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 ha. I stole things, and I'm sorry for it. Ha, 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 ha. I got sick of tuberculosis. Oh. I said, you're the craziest bunch of men. You've laughed at everything I've said. Just laugh out loud. And so I told the story of Lester Sumrall. And they sat and they laughed. Sometimes they'd even hit the desk, you know. No, they hadn't had a sideshow in that area for a long time. I was so mad when I got through. I said, go on home. I didn't tell them to come back or anything. And under my breath, I said, I hope all of you go to hell. I didn't like my first congregation at all. So my friend and I, we went home with one of them. I said, man. I said, I think it'd been better to have died. You get in a mess like this. Then I cooked up something. You know, we were always good cookers. I said, you know, now they won't come back. I told them to go home. They won't come back. And so tomorrow night, when there's nobody there but you and me, I'll tell the Lord, I said, now you see, Lord, I did a good job. A very good job, you see. Finished my work. Now I'll go back home and go to work and be a businessman. You know, you can just cook up things in your brain that don't belong to your spirit. So all day long I was saying, man, I finished that thing off last night. Really did. Got to church, and there were 40 people there, including some ladies and a couple of kids. Oh. I said, now wait a minute. How did this happen? Those 8 men began to tell everybody else about the revival. No, there was no revival. They said, the biggest liar that ever came through these parts has arrived. Says, you've never heard lies like this guy can lie. Come out and hear his lies. So they came to hear a liar, not a preacher. And when we got there and I saw all those people, I knew I had to do something. I knew my friend wasn't going to take up much time. He might have been up there 6 minutes the next time, but he handed her back. The main thing he did was to lead in prayer. And so I had to do it, and I didn't know what to do. So I did the same thing I did the night before. I said, now I tell you why I'm here. I was born in a half-Christian home, half-baked. My mother was a Christian, my father was, ha, 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 ha. That bunch of laughers again, you know, spitting tobacco juice and laughing at me. It was miserable. You better believe it was. And so I told the whole story, and they'd talk out loud. They'd turn, so see, I told you about this liar. You hear that? Yeah, I'm hearing. You know, and I was stopped talking, and they were talking, you know, among themselves with my talking. And so I said, well, that is just terrible. That is just awful. And so we got through that night. I didn't give an altar call. Brother, I didn't want anybody to get saved. I was too upset at him. Then the guy that we were going to stay with, he said, young man, says, if you don't work, you don't eat. Says, you're going to stay here for a few days. Says, you're going to feed the hogs. I said, feed the hogs? He said, yes. Says, if you don't work, you don't eat. Well, I said, preaching is working. No. He said, that's not working what you're doing. Well, that was about right. And so I'd never seen in my life a receptacle for hog food before. They call it slot bucket. I'd never seen one before. I'd lived in the city all my life. We'd had ham on the table and bacon on the table, but we'd never had it in the pen, pig pen. And I had an awakening. The food that they fed their hog was the scraps and the leftovers and the awful mess. And they put it in these big 5-gallon can buckets that used to have standard oil in them. They put wire across it. You pick it up, and it would squash together and run out the side onto my pants. I had 2 pair of pants, one off and one on. And when one got dirty, I personally had to wash and iron the other pair. I had to stay up with the times. And I don't mean maybe. Everybody was poor. That included the preacher boy. And I got out there to feed those hogs, the most ungrateful things in the world, you know. They're terrible. They are just simply awful. And the way they would eat, you know, was so terrible, so unnice, you know. And they just gobbled it all up as if, you know, they weren't going to get enough. And I would just get madder all the time. And right by it was a cornfield, and I just went and laid down in the cornfield. And I said, God, I must be the prodigal son. I must be the prodigal son. Says, I'm in the pig pen, and I'm away from home. I must be the prodigal. You must be paying me off for my sins that I did when I was at home. And God began to speak to me. He said, no. He says, if you will be faithful in little things, I'll give you bigger things to take care of. And if you won't quit and won't stop, if you will march forward, I'll let you touch many people by my power, and you will bless multitudes of people. I got up out of the cornfield by the pig pen. I went back into the house and took a bath so it wouldn't stink like the pigs, and began to study the Bible to see how to preach to those people. Well, 5 or 6 weeks later, I didn't know how long to stay, but God began to save those people. Now, I wasn't nice, and it was God, it wasn't me. There were times that I'd say, if you want to get saved and kneel there on the altar, I'd pick up my Bible and go out the side door, and I was gone. I didn't stay to see where they got saved. That wasn't part of the deal. My deal was to preach, and I had nothing to do with getting people saved. So if they got saved, they had to want to. It was pretty miserable. But finally, after 6 weeks, we had a whole gang of people saved. And they said, water baptism, water baptism. I said, oh, yeah, sure. But I'd never baptized anybody. They said, you're a preacher. You baptize us. Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. They said, we got a creek close by. We'll go down and get baptized. So on a Sunday afternoon, here we went down, 200 or 300 people. And I said, how many want to be baptized? There were about 67 to be baptized. I backed off into the river, and if you preachers are watching, don't ever back off into a river. You're always the deepest one. When the man in front of you has water to here, you've got it to here. So you are at every disadvantage. Turn yourself around and let the one you're baptizing be in the deeper place and you in the shallow place. Well, I had to learn that. So I backed off where I could face the people. I should have let the candidate for baptism face the people. But anyway, the first farmer that came down had a big pair of overalls on. Of course, they all had on overalls. This man must have weighed 350 pounds. He was about that broad. Those enormous overalls. He must have stood 6'4". I am 5'8". So when he walked down in that water, I couldn't see the sun anymore. All I could see was a Hulk, like Goliath. I says, dear God, why did he come first? You know, the first one I'd ever baptized. And he blacked out the sun. So he got down there and I said, you better help me. Oh, he says, yeah, little preacher, I'll help you. Yeah, I didn't weigh 100 pounds yet, you know. And so I said, I whispered to him, I guess I did. I said, when I've done this in the name of the Father and the Son, I said, you squat. I'll do anything you tell me to do, little preacher. So I got a hold of the back of his suspenders, of his overalls, and I put my hand up in front. And when you laid a hand across him, like laying your hand across a cow, you know, I couldn't get all the way across him. And I said, according to your acceptance of Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, and because you have denied that you are a sinner, and you have positively accepted Jesus Christ as your Savior, I, upon the authority of the Word of God, the Bible, do here and now, before this group of witnesses to your water baptism, obey the words of the gospel in Matthew's gospel, saying that I now baptize you in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost. And I began to pull. And I went down first. As I pulled, he got on top of me, and I went to the bottom. Man, you would have given $1,000 to have been there. And when I came up, of course, he was very helpful, all he could, you know. He was just too big. Those farmers were actually rolling on the sand by the river. They thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever, it was the funniest thing they'd ever seen in their life. I came up next place, and I said, you stand by to help me. So I made old Goliath help me. So I was sure I wasn't going to let that happen anymore. And so the rest of them were smaller. I should have taken him last. I'd have learned something. But anyway, I baptized them all. Out of that meeting went 2 missionaries to Africa. Out of that meeting came one of the finest pastors in this country. And they have worshiped in that place from that time until this time. I went from little country schoolhouse to little country schoolhouse. Irritated and agitated on the inside, not wanting to do it, telling the people constantly, sometimes I'd say, I don't want you to think I like you, because I don't. I said, really, I didn't want to die of tuberculosis. And I was going to die of tuberculosis. And God said I could live if I'd preach. And so I'm preaching so I won't die of tuberculosis. So I hope all of you understand that. And if you understand that, then you know why I act like I do and do what I do. Maybe that's the reason why sometimes in 1 week, for the total offering, I got 26 cents. Of course, it was during the Depression. 26 pennies. Nobody gave a nickel. Nobody gave that much. That would be a lot of money, a nickel. 26 people gave a penny apiece. And so we had to find ways of living. And I did. I mean, after all, I'm not stupid. When I got an offering like that, I got right up and I says, how many have chickens at your house? They all raised their hands. I said, there'll be a coop outside the door tomorrow night. Every one of you bring me a chicken or 2 and put it in that coop. Well, by the time they got through the next night, I had about 3 coops of chickens. I took those over to the wholesale poultry house, and I came back with money in my pocket. So I know how to live. There's no problem with my knowing how to live. I've known that since I was a boy 12 years old. I was an innovator. When I was 12 years old, I knew how to parch peanuts. I put them in the little bags, take them over to a factory close by, sell them at the time they're hungry, about 3:30 in the afternoon, just after I'd get out of school, and make me $2 or $3. I knew what it was on a Saturday and in the summertime to get me a wagon and put some ice in it, get me a shaver, and get some sweet syrup and put on top of it, and sell snowballs. give a boy 50 cents a day to pull it, and come home with $5 or $6 in the evening. So I knew how to make money. From the time I was about 12 years old, I made all my money until I got sick in bed. I knew how to make money. There was no problem there. But now I was in a different business. I was preaching the gospel, going from little country schoolhouse to little country schoolhouse, and wasn't enjoying it. No, and I wasn't liking it. I remember one time we had a house full of people. Always, I stayed in the country. Don't remember meeting a preacher, and I don't remember seeing a church. I just stayed in the country where I belonged. And country people are the nicest people in the world. And they will endure you when others won't. And they'll keep coming back when you wonder why. And by the way, the young man, he began to where he could sing and to lead songs. And so he got better. And they say that I got a little better. I don't know, because I sure wasn't a happy preacher. I was the most unhappy one. And unthankful and ungrateful, I suppose you'd say. Now, this went on for 18 months. 18 months. But this meeting that we had one Sunday, and there was a young lady crying about halfway back down the aisle, and I think she may be crying for a boyfriend and thought I'd make a pretty good one. I don't know. But I walked back to her and I said, young lady, would you get saved? And she said, no, I don't want to get saved. I said, don't you want to go to heaven? She said, no. I said, you just go to hell then. And everybody in the whole place heard it, you know. And they were all standing for the altar call. And I turned my back. I heard something boom, boom. I looked around, and she had fainted and fallen in the middle aisle. Well, as quick as you could bat an eye, the ladies got around her, you know, and got her back to again. And I walked back and I said, whatever happened to you? Well, she said, you told me to go to hell. Well, I said, you said you didn't want to go to heaven. There isn't any other place to go. She says, well, I never thought a preacher was going to tell me to go to hell. Well, I said that you didn't want to go to heaven. Where are you going? There's only two places. She said, I'm going to get saved right now. Well, I said, fine, come on up. So we got her saved. And so the people that we got saved were kind of rough, you know. We were kind of rough shown. And that's not good. That is not good. At that moment, I didn't know I was a man of faith. But when I left home, I had less than $1 in the world. I had about 65 cents. I never asked my mother to loan me $1. I never asked her for a single thing. I left home believing that God was God and that everything would be all right. And so I left home with less than $1. And that began to mark me as a person of faith. 18 months after that, we had worked from Panama City, Florida, all the way up to Tennessee. And it was in Tennessee where I had the second vision that changed my life and made me the person that you're watching right now. In the next episode, I'll tell you all about that.